And welcome everybody. The most effective way for leaders to coach experts. So just reference to what Grant was saying there, this has been an almost exclusive focus of ours for the last 5 or 6 years. And I'm spending considerable time with these experts, often 4.5 days in a classroom, pre-COVID. Now lots of pod sessions delivered virtually. Lots of one-on-one conversations, whether that's coaching, shaping action plans, meetings with managers, and so on. So we've built up quite a picture on that basis. So what are we going to walk through today? Typically, where are the areas that experts need more rounding out? What might be an appropriate yardstick, so it's not just a subjective conversation between manager and direct report? How to make learning and an expert's further evolution somewhat compelling to them. Looking at some very specific coaching questions that can ask, and then absolutely we want to save a good 20 or so minutes for good conversation back and forth, hear your thoughts, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I suspect those of you who've been following us for a while will know something about this. Experts are people with deep proficiency in a particular professional technical field. We've mentioned a few here. IT, that's particularly where we started, but increasingly people in finance, people in law, engineering, data analysts, and so on. More often than not, they've got deep technical expertise, but they haven't had the enterprise skills, things like influencing or stakeholder engagement. They may not even see those things as relevant, or if they have had exposure to them, it's been in such a generic sense that it's not really pitched as to why they might be interested. So maybe they've attended a leadership program where someone's been bombarding them with general leadership rhetoric, and they have been looking for the escape button. Now the challenge is if they don't get development in those other areas to make use of their expertise and put their expertise to work, then they often stagnate. They can become cynical, they can certainly become marginalized, and they certainly don't have the kind of impact that you'd hope. So these are some of the areas that we've found typically, and these 5 bullets came from conversations that we've been having with leaders of experts in general about the common gaps, and we were really amazed at how common these 5 bullets came up. Lacking a sense of the big picture. Sometimes this could be indifference on the part of the expert. They just don't really want to know. They're just fascinated by their particular discipline and couldn't really care about the rest. Sometimes it's that they're just not included on the receiver lists of this kind of information that's there, or they just need to be able to talk it through. Sometimes it's that they hear strategy and it looks like such a wishy-washy piece of motherhood apple pie that they take no interest in it. They just think it's some kind of vaporware. Careful wording of the second bullet. They don't value their emotional intelligence. Contrary to myth, experts actually do possess emotional intelligence. They just never thought it was particularly important or something they should focus on. In fact, they might have even thought it was something that contaminated pure objectivity. It turns out that they're certainly very quick at picking up the skills, whether that's listening or influencing, once those things are apparent. Struggling to navigate political landscapes. Again, they've often thought that this is someone else's responsibility, and it's probably a sign of poor organizational design. Taking ownership of networking throughout the organization is generally a big insight that comes when they're getting developed. They often have such deep expertise that it's actually hard for them to communicate what it is they do in layman's terms in a way that doesn't deter other people from being interested. Sometimes they even feel that if they're going to try and translate those things, it's sort of dumbing it down and insulting their own professional credibility. So this can often be a challenge because they can speak in a language that no one else makes sense of. And this definitely goes towards that marginalization I spoke of. As a consequence of all the above, just not having the impact that they would both like to make, but also the organization needs of them. So, we talked about a yardstick earlier. This may not be particularly clear on a small screen here, but this is a follow-up resource that I'm happy to send to you. You can also download from our website. We developed an expertship framework to look at the common enterprise skills that can complement people's technical capabilities. You can see on the left-hand side, we have the technical domain. This is an area that experts typically have thought is their sole focus. This introduces a few other areas that they might not have even considered. Solutioning, that being something to do with how they take the brief, how they understand requirements, how they use a consulting methodology. Training others up, this may be counterintuitive to experts who may want to rule the roost or feel that their value is in being the wisest person in the room. And even in expert knowledge, this has a lot to do with how they keep their knowledge up to date, how they curate knowledge for theirs and others' reference, and even how they produce thought leadership. But when we start to move to the right, we look at the value domain. We're starting to look at their knowledge of the internal and external environments. How well do they understand the industry, the organizational drivers, how much interest do they take in the organizational metrics, and so on. And then on the far right, we have the relationship domain, all to do with people skills. Which stakeholders are they seeking to engage with? Do they have an engagement strategy? Are they on the front foot? Are they collaborating and easy to work with and influential, and so on? So very rare that there's been any formal development in those areas. We see that this is a huge responsibility for the leaders of experts to open up the experts' minds to the fact that these are useful and in fact an expected part of their job, but also to give them the tools to develop those capabilities. You'll also notice that there are the 4 levels that are described, sometimes called as a value continuum. A little bit more detail here. Derailing behaviors would be the highly problematic behaviors, and in a moment I'll give an example of one of the capability areas. So for instance, not even being able to speak a language that anyone else could understand, that would be a derailer. Specialist is sort of entry-level practitioner. They've got the necessary capability for doing what's expected right now, typically just reacting to the traffic that comes their way. Progressing up this ladder towards master expert has largely to do with getting more focused on outcomes rather than inputs or processes. It's being able to talk the language of the business. It's being able to get on the front foot and start to influence and have massive sway. Our experience is people often find their way at least to that intermediate expert level almost by themselves, but without the master expert level being called out, without some kind of development pathway, people often don't get there. So here we've got an example. This is one of 27 subsets that you'll find, and again, we might be open to sharing some of these with you, but communicating is a really commonplace challenge that experts have. Here we see at the derailing level, it's all about the technical jargon. It's all about rational persuasion, browbeating people with superior logic, and they come across as closed-minded and deeply opinionated, or even just aloof and distant. The specialist has at least started to make that transition, but you can see they're rarely on the front foot, proactively communicating and collaborating. As you get to that intermediate level, we couldn't fit it all on one page, so you'll see the master expert on the next level. Now we're starting to develop some really good listening skills, more and more leadership in terms of the collaborative approach, more and more influencing methodologies, translating concepts. And at mastery, it's bringing to life complex concepts through devices of storytelling, inspiring. In demand, people are seeking this person out, advanced listening skills. But most of the time, when this kind of yardstick is introduced, not only do leaders of experts go, yes, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to get across, but experts themselves start to see it as something a little bit more scientific than just a very generic, you need more emotional intelligence. So here are some of the ways that we found leaders of experts in particular can really help experts figure out how to develop those enterprise skills. First, actually having a competency framework like the ones we've shown. If it's all merely subjective and it's just general, you need to be better at working with people, you need to position this more in the context of the strategy. It doesn't really give experts who've got that deeply analytical mind a sense of why those things are important, what they look like in practice, progressive stages of realizing them, and so on. So a competency framework, we built this one, the one that we've shared with you, and I think that's about its fourth iteration, because we were hoping that we could just find one and lift it out and use it. And while there are some hierarchies for different disciplines, capabilities for finance people or IT people or so on, rarely does it really call out all of those enterprise skills. So what we found is both leaders of experts and experts respond really, really well to that framework. But that framework is only as good as being able to map where you are. And our experience is that, you know, sometimes people can map realistically where they are, but they often benefit considerably from getting feedback from stakeholders. We developed a 360 tool. It goes out to a wide variety, including removed and immediate stakeholders and immediate cohort they work with. And that produces huge insights in terms of where someone is and what the next steps are, and also what the appetite is from stakeholders to see the expert develop in particular ways. Real play. Sometimes people use the term role play. We often get lots of rolling of eyes because not only are people uncomfortable with role play generally, but experts in particular don't want to do anything that involves pretense. A real play, by contrast, is rehearsing a real life conversation. Let's say they're meeting to make a presentation to the board next week. The leader can sit with the person and actually go through a rehearsal, not only of the presentation itself, but the kind of Q&A that might come at the back end. This is very helpful. Quite often experts have got a very clear idea of the world in their head, but until it's actually translated into how they show up and behave in a real life situation, they might get unstuck just by the curly nature of life generally. And practicing courageous conversations, practicing negotiating, practicing different interactions in meetings, all of these things we call real play. Leaders may otherwise feel that, you know, who am I to tell an expert what to do in these different situations? And experts might even be a little immune to advice. Sometimes the leader doesn't even have credibility or depth in the particular area of expertise that expert has. Real play really levels the field because it actually allows them to simulate a real life situation. We would absolutely endorse that leaders shouldn't be doing a huge amount of telling. Not only is it a very useless way typically of getting someone to change behavior, but experts, again, especially immune. So we're going to look in a moment at iGrow, which is a coaching framework. Many of you may have heard of the GROW model by Sir John Whitmore. We've evolved that a little and we found it particularly effective with experts. We're going to talk to that because we think those coaching conversations are one of the most useful ways of growing expertise. There's also something that we found especially helpful, which is developing a personal growth plan. So it's not enough to just have vague ideas. Yes, I need to work on my communication, but actually working out, and I'll show you an example in a moment, a template. This is also something available from our site and that we will send to you afterwards of what a personal growth plan looks like. Making it a very concrete step-by-step measures, what behaviors need to change, what impact should change, very comprehensive. And typically we have quite a few follow-up conversations with leaders, with experts to see how they're progressing the implementation of those plans. So that reviewing of progress regularly is quite important. If it's just seen as a tick and flick exercise, like the annual development planning, then it's probably not going to be that useful. And there's something else we wanted to talk to you about, which is the Expertship Growth Guide. So for all of those different capabilities that we've referred to in the plan, we've developed a resource with literally hundreds of ideas of how you develop each of those capabilities. Something that really helps develop people's personal growth plans. In fact, that was what we found. We found that so many experts were saying, I know I need to work on my stakeholder engagement, but where do I begin and what practical things can I do? So that's where that emerged. So here's probably not too visible there or too clear there, but you can see the shape of a personal growth plan. It really walks somebody through the process of planning. Very, very helpful conversations. I facilitate no end of conversations between leaders and experts on the content of these, and they both find the process rewarding. So you can see what's the current behaviour and capability level, and what's the consequences of that, what's the desired capability, what's the payoff of that, what steps will they take, what's the time frames, what are the measures of success, and so on. And I'll just flash you the Expertship Growth Guide front cover. It's available on Amazon, and I'm sure there'll be some follow-up information about that after the session. So this is the iGrowth framework, and this is a coaching framework that both leaders and experts really seem to respond to well. They get the sense of the logic very, very quickly. And in a second, I'll show you some of the sorts of questions that can come out of it. So one thing that's new over and above, one of our innovations over and above the usual growth framework is intent. So this is where the person, the leader in this case, initiating the conversation would say, let me tell you why I'd like us to have this conversation. And it may be where they signal that this is not about fixing you, this is about exploring together what would great communication look like, and to what extent is it going to aid you in what it is that you're doing. This can make all the difference between the receptivity of the coachee or there being, stonewalling, really. Typical, as with the growth framework, you then start a conversation around goals, and I will share with you an example on the next page, but it might simply be, with this particular stakeholder, what's the desired end state? Where would you like to be in a year or so from now? Now, obviously, both parties can contribute to that conversation, and it's useful for the leader to go into that conversation, not just with the question, but with their own idea of what a good answer is, and maybe their own suggestions. The biggest thing that leaders often need to get their head around is they can just ask the question, as long as they have their own ideas in their back pocket, and the question often does most of the work. Then we might invite the coachee to share their perspective of the current reality. So how do you think this relationship is tracking it right now? Which kind of problems do you think that you're facing? Why do you think those problems have come about? And again, you'll see that the next R, again, this is one of our innovations, is that the leader can also share, well, here's some of the feedback that I've been getting. Here's some of the observations that I've noticed of how you're working in that relationship. Here's some of the challenges I think you have in those situations. Then pure open question to the coachee, what are some of the steps that you can take in order to achieve your goal and deal with some of those challenges? Create a menu of options. Leader can also add to those options. And then will is decision time. So which of those options are you going to move forward with, how and when, and starting to nail the details. So this is a summary of those questions. Goal question is always about an optimal outcome to move towards. The reality questions are about historic approaches and contrasting the ideal with what you've had historically. What have been some of the obstructions, challenges, obstacles? The O, the options, is always a very open question. It's about getting a list, a menu of things that could possibly be done, and it's about ideas generation. And then that final question is all about landing the specifics. So we found that both experts and leaders of experts really love the structure, get it very, very quickly in their minds. And this is probably the most helpful part of creating an appetite and ownership of someone's learning. So I might wrap up here. I think we're about halfway through, 8:21. And I'll turn to Grant and ask if there are any particular questions or comments that have come through chat.
Yes, there are. Can you hear me, Dom?
I can hear you, can't see you.
And, oh, sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. Yes, we have had a couple of questions. You don't have to send questions to me privately, people. Please feel free to just put them in the chat channel if there's something you wanted to ask. We were asked, do you find that leaders of experts and experts themselves properly engage with real plays? So if they're asked to do it, do they push back? Do they roll their eyes? Are they happy to do it?
It's all about the setup. That's our experience. First of all, we use them quite a lot in our formal training programs and so on. And then we've done quite a bit of design to make sure the scenario is credible. And credible is probably the biggest issue here. Because if someone goes, that would never happen, people don't behave like that, then instantly they decide that the whole idea is just useless and a waste of their time and so on. I think that leaders inside organizations have even more opportunity to make something real, because in fact it is about taking real place scenarios and saying, let's rehearse. I don't think you actually have to necessarily call it a real play. That might in fact turn people off straight away. But say, look, I know you've got conversation X coming up with the CFO next week. Let's kind of talk through how that might happen. What I might do is actually take the role of the CFO and fire some questions at you that are prompted by whatever you said to me, and let's just see how you might handle those. So I think if the setup is right, then it doesn't sort of create that, what are they doing here? It doesn't create that kind of response.
So it's very much about making it practical and about something that's coming.
Very real, very credible, and legitimizing it. This is a conversation that may or may not produce a great result. They care about the conversation with the CFO. Let's envision how that might play out. And so most people aren't averse to having a practice. So sometimes it's just better to use words like that. Practice, sometimes simulation, but simulation can get very close to role playing.
Fantastic. So we've got a couple of questions around emotional intelligence as well. But Alistair's just popped up to say, Alistair, do you want to actually talk about the sort of love-hate relationship that people have in the program with real plays?
Yeah, but not really. I mean, I think a lot of the people on the call will have this experience, because there's a lot of experience on the webinar where, there is that grumpiness as soon as we get the real play out, as Dominic was describing there. But I don't know how many programs we run with experts now. It's going to be a lot, and they always say that they really made them feel uncomfortable, but then they discover that they're written in such a way, mostly by Dominic, that they're very credible and they're very real situations, and actually they learned most from them. That's typically what happens. And I think there's a couple of fast lead coaches on the webinar who, we use these real plays all the time in fast lead as well. Very similar. So you just have to have the courage to say, whether you like it or not, we're going to do one, okay? And then they really get into them, in my experience. I'm sure that's the same experience as Dom.
Yeah, experts have very high levels of IQ, and if the thing makes them feel uncomfortable, which would be an emotion, by the way, then often their intelligence comes to their defense. So if they can pull apart any little piece of either why we're doing this or, well, that would never happen, it actually enables them to manage their discomfort. What they don't realize is it's just pure rationalization. If it can be set up safely, if it can be set up as a little bit of fun, actually it's fine. Grant, you were saying there was a question or a comment about emotional intelligence.
So there's actually two, but let's start with Megan's. How do we drive and maintain the aha moment around emotional intelligence viability for experts?
Oh, there's so many different aspects of that question.
Well,
obviously, emotional intelligence is something that everybody has. There may be a belief that people who are expertise in a technical field are uninterested or possibly even handicapped in some regard in this space. All the research says it's a muscle that any of us can develop at any stage. I'm not, for instance, someone who's naturally empathic, but once it made intellectual sense to me that empathy would be a good thing to acquire, and I started to put my energy into it, I found that actually, even if it's not instinctual much of the time, it's something that I can do, and it's a skill that can easily be learned. So I think so much of this in the first instance is validating necessity. This is where, for instance, real plays can be useful, because if they solve the technical question but they didn't bring the stakeholder on the journey, then examining why that was the case becomes quite interesting, and it often then becomes to do with things like bedside manner. It becomes to do with things like emotional intelligence, your relating skills, and so on. And as soon as those things obviously become significant and important, so I would actually argue people with high IQ often understand the need for emotional intelligence and also apply all of that IQ in the building of their emotional intelligence. And I think experiential is probably one of the ways to get it started. Maintaining momentum, yeah, that's another interesting thing. This is where I think leaders checking in regularly. So if someone has built into their personal growth plan, I want to develop my emotional intelligence, making some concrete ways of assessing that and doing those routine checks is probably a very useful way of monitoring progress. And I think rewarding people. Often people aren't used to actually being caught doing anything right. And I imagine a lot of experts have had feedback over the years, you're not a people person. So, you know, even for the leader to say, hey, I think you really handled that dodgy question today from the change manager particularly well. I want to commend you on that. Just gives that encouragement to the expert. You've got it in you. And yeah, I'm seeing progress. I don't know if that answers the whole question. It was a very complex question with many facets. Let me know if I missed anything.
Okay, no, I mean, there's a whole sort of collection of issues to unpack about how self-aware experts are as to how they're coming across. I mean, you say that experts have the potential to learn this and they have the potential to grow into it. Do you feel that experts are obviously everybody has the capacity to do this, but do you feel that they are self-aware? They're actually monitoring themselves to see whether they're behaving in an emotionally intelligent way?
My sense is that once the significance of emotional intelligence with all its components, including self-awareness, is apparent, they become particularly eager to acquire it. I think in the first instance, they're not just going to be convinced by someone throwing around the term emotional intelligence that it's either something they need to pay particular attention to. They may go, you know, my job is to analyze this particular decision and see if it's free from risks or not. And, you know, what's the conversation? And this is where leaders particularly come in. Once the conversation is, well, I think the analysis is part A of your role, and then getting people to adopt the risk framework is part B. That getting people to adopt, we have to understand, is not a purely irrational decision. Why is it that we've been driving this process for the last 2 or 3 years and we've only got marginal take-up? Let's explore why we're getting resistance. And, you know, emotional intelligence will actually provide a way of understanding other people's responses. It'll provide a way of going, how can I bring more excitement or tell the right kind of story? So as soon as people start to see what it is and that it isn't just some new age schmaltz, it's equally scientific, then they actually become quite eager to master it. That's our experience. I would say of the 700 or so experts I've had a close hand in, at least 400 or 500 of those would have had emotional intelligence as one of their key learns from the program they attended, and one of the key areas they wish to move forward with.
Okay, so we have a question from Tanya. Experts need to feel they're expert at what they do. What do you believe is critical in terms of ideas for managers to motivate experts to draw them out into the scary world of giving something new a go? Can you sort of talk a little bit about that? Sorry, Tanya, I've not expressed that question very well. Did that make sense, Tom?
I think so. Tanya can let us know if we didn't quite get the essence of it here. So it is an interesting phenomenon because, let's say they're an engineer or let's say they're someone in IT. Precision might be everything to the successful execution of that role. If they get one line of code wrong, if they get one calculation wrong, we could have a disaster on our hands. And yet now we're moving into the murky world of, human beings, and it's not quite as black and white. And that may be uncomfortable. The lack of exactness, the lack of precision, may be something that's a little uncomfortable. Equally, I think that leaders can be very vulnerable at this stage and say, here's the journey that I went on to start getting comfortable with ambiguity. Here's the journey that I went on to start making more sense of human motivations, and introduce it as another sort of interesting science experiment. One that in fact may still be at such early stages. I mean, psychology is a science. I'm not meaning any offense to anybody here, but relative to some of the other sciences, maybe like physics or biology or whatever, it's still at such an early stage. We know far less than we'd like to know at this point. Far more things that will be acquired in due course. Almost, setting it up as you're a pioneer in a new field. And you're going to have to trust your instincts at some point. You're going to do quite a bit of trial and error, but you can still take almost a scientific methodology. What's your hypothesis of a situation? Okay, let's now test that hypothesis. All right, what did we learn from that? So you don't have to abandon science to get into this field. I don't know if I may have gone completely off reservation.
Okay, so we've got. Do you want to stop screen sharing for a second, since we've
Sure.
got since we're sort of talking to you? I know we have like 2 more slides to end it with. What do you see as this is a really interesting question from Walmifa. I'm sorry, I don't quite know what your actual name is. From your experience, do you notice a generational shift in coaching sessions with experts? For example, do newcomers have greater awareness of enterprise skills?
Oh, I guess it's not something I've given a lot of thought to. It's interesting because I'd say the average age of experts on our program has been getting younger. I thought perhaps in the first instance we got quite a few boomers and certainly X's. Probably X's is the biggest population of experts, ironically speaking. And there was potentially a little bit of cynicism because many of the concepts that we might introduce they'd heard, they just hadn't had them presented in a particularly compelling way. I think more and more of the younger experts that we're starting to see now have had exposure to these ideas in the course of their education. Perhaps as they've acquired their technical qualifications, there's at least been some mention of things like, consulting skills or your emotional intelligence or your collaborating abilities or whatever. And it could be that, someone in Gen Y or even subsequently, you're naturally more socially oriented, and therefore some of those things become a little bit more obvious. It's a really interesting question, and I don't know if we've actually got research, so those are just my initial impressions.
Okay. I think if we do come back to this, I think as someone who got a computing degree in 1994 and deals with a lot of young people now, I actually have some quite strong views on this one.
Well, go on, share them.
Well, I think I can only talk about the tech world, but when you're talking about the tech world, you're dealing with, I came up through what would be a sort of enterprise computing space where we were asked to do collaborative social exercises, but everybody thought they were nonsense. And you're then dealing with a sort of younger generation who have come up with the idea of product management, with the idea of customers being at the end of what you're doing. And it's very much more integrated in tech, at least, into what you have to understand as your responsibility. So in tech, and now that we have engineering leadership as a sort of discipline, there's a huge difference between what I learned as a Generation X and what people are doing now. Just absolutely massive. Okay, so we also have another question here, which is about onboarding. How easy is it to get, let's say somebody's just starting at your organization, how easy is it to get them to adopt iGrow, to sort of start to adopt enterprise skills? You know, how fast can you onboard people?
Well, this is where I think, yes, if you can socialize them into, here is our competency framework. So in addition to your technical capabilities, some of the other things we expect of you, you need to be able to foster a minimal level of great collaboration with stakeholders, for instance. If that's an expectation that's even called out in someone's position description, obviously really helps. If right from the outset, people know they're going to be measured against those things, they're going to get feedback, perhaps in their annual appraisal against those things, there are development programs of those things, it all helps a person go, okay, I see that it's legitimate, and it's obviously valuable. It's something I should aspire to be good at. I think leaders can introduce these things at any stage, and it is best introduced via a kind of conversation. So, for instance, iGrow can be introduced to, you know, help broaden a person's sense of what their desired capability and impact should be. A bold question might very much be that. Let's, you know, come up with our idealized sense of what success looks like. Which are some of the areas that we're not getting the breakthroughs that we want right now, might be in our question. So I think leaders and experts definitely respond well to iGrow. We have a program focused particularly on leaders of experts, and we look at several components. How do you articulate your expectations of the people reporting to you? What do you do with feedback, particularly if the feedback is behavioral? How do you have a development conversation? And iGrow's at the center of all that, and people just love it. People respond really, really well.
Okay, Tanya has asked, Dom, can you talk to how you see the expertship framework working within an organization's leadership framework?
Oh, yeah, great question. And this is my old friend, Tanya, I believe, my old colleague from PwC. I don't think there's too many Tanya Hannas out there. So, hi, Tanya. Lovely to see you again.
You're right.
Yeah, so initially, actually, when we first started to develop the concept of expertship, we thought of it as knowledge leadership. You might not be leading people. So it may not be about, you know, are you a natural coach or someone who can set performance goals for people or whatever, but you are responsible for leading a practice, a knowledge practice or whatever. And we did see it very much as leadership skills. We found that, in fact, most experts balked at the mention of the word leadership, and so we found that coining a term like expertship was better. But in reality, we are looking at people exercising informal influence. So unlike most individual contributors, which is where experts are often seen by HR because they don't have people reporting in, often experts are operating at very, very senior levels because of the kind of expertise they represent. And therefore, they need every bit as much of the same influencing skills as anybody who happens to manage leaders. I'd even argue nowadays that with many people leadership skills becoming more and more commoditized, much of what even needs to happen in leadership generally has got to do with these enterprise skills, networking across the organization, understanding the market context, and so on. So we think they're very, very compatible. And we think it's a particularly good conversational tool at a time of sort of talent review annually, to go, let's discuss what track you're on. Now, we see you on an expert track rather than a people leadership track, but here are some of the opportunities that we think that opens up, and here are some of the capabilities that we think you need to acquire. So we see them very complementary. I don't know if that's answered your question, Tanya. Oh, there you are. You were muted for a second. I'm not hearing you. No, can't hear you.
You're not muted, Tanya. You're just not coming through for some reason. Do you want to try again?
All good. Very helpful. Thank you.
Lovely to see you again.
Yeah, thanks.
I might just add, because it's such a great question, that one of the key things that we see in most organizations is that they have a very clearly defined leadership pipeline, going up from one level to another. And on the expert track that Dom's been talking about, that's not clear at all. In fact, it's, very ill defined. And if you're on one of the webinars we did a little bit earlier on, a few weeks ago, we talked about the 9-box grid that is very often used around talent, as Dom was referencing there, that it's really important in these sort of talent reviews. And of course, a lot of experts get put in the top left-hand box, which is high performance, no potential. And there's sort of a box up there on the 9-box grid for technical experts, or sometimes HR call them technical stars to make them feel better, that they've got no potential. But the reality is that that potential is being defined as potential to lead teams, to be managers. And certainly my experience is very similar to Dominic's, where as soon as you sort of mention, do you want to go into management, generally speaking, experts run a mile. So we're doing quite a bit of work with several organizations. APRA jumps to mind, where we're helping them build a capability framework and an expertship pipeline, if you like, that sits next to the leadership pipeline and gives experts an opportunity to get up to master expert and have the kudos to be seen as one of the senior team, rather than just getting stuck halfway up that pipeline. So, I think it's, and we're seeing more and more companies now really beginning to do that and think about that, particularly in the last year or so, where experts' contribution to organizations, particularly in the innovation space, is becoming more and more important. And we've probably seen that in spades in the last 10 weeks, I would say.
Other questions?
Okay, so we're now, sorry, just to do a bit of housekeeping. We try to run these sessions to about 8:45, which it's about to be now, and then have, for people who can stay a little bit longer, because people often have 9 o'clock meetings and have to run off and do them. For people who can stay a little bit longer, we have sort of additional Q&A. So I think, Dom, it's actually just about to go 8:45. Do you want to do your sort of wrap up presentations, and then we can do more Q&A for the people who can stay?
Yeah, well, my experience is leaders of experts have responded particularly well to these bullet points that we shared with you. Often because they haven't known quite where to start, and just being able to say, here are several things that you can instantly see yourself doing. You don't have to be the world's expert and start dictating to your direct report what it is that they do. Simply do these kind of real play scenarios, come up with this kind of framework, use these kind of I-grow questions, and you can instantly feel like you're adding value and being useful. Leaders of experts often suffer from the same imposter syndrome that's quite common amongst experts as well. So many of them have felt that this is particularly helpful, something they can pick up and use straight away. So perhaps I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining. Feel welcome to stay if you wish, and I know that Grant will be organising a follow-up pack with many of the resources we showed on screen today.
Yes, I think we can definitely send out the video and also some material about the expertship model and the capability framework. We have another webinar coming next week about purpose, by the way. Dom, is there any chance you can share that screen?
Oh, the screen on purpose.
The last 2 slides. That you've
got.
Apologies,
yeah, okay.
Yep. You can see this is very well rehearsed, everybody. And while we're doing it, do we have further questions? I mean, I have one here where we are being asked, how do you convince? So sorry, we will be sending this out next week. webinar on purpose. How do you create purpose in remote teams? Does it, does it override culture? Is it the same thing? Is it a different thing? Is it more important now that we're having remote teams? And just going back to the other questions, Don, we've also had one about how we get experts to see emotional intelligence, coaching, expertship, etc., as a brand positive for them. Like, how do we convince them that it's a good thing?
It's a great question. In fact, brand is the very first concept that we start talking about in our workshops for this very reason. Brand, you could argue, is an outside-in way of looking at identity. Who are you? How do you believe you add value? How do you want to be experienced? And I think once people realize, well, yes, being the wise old sage in a particular field is kind of nice, but being high impact is so much more interesting. Being a thought leader is so much more interesting. So once people actually start to develop a broader sense of brand, it's quite funny, because some of the first questions we ask people is, before you get your 360 back, what do you think your brand is with different constituent groups, stakeholder groups? And quite often, they do realize their brand is quite limited. One-trick ponies or something along those lines, and they much prefer to be thought of as someone who can have broad organizational influence and relevance. Many of them realize also that some of their problematic behaviors, some of them occupationally driven, like often having to be the person who says no if someone's violating a core principle or process, is potentially resulting in some collateral damage to their brand, and therefore needs some attention. How else would they like to be experienced? How would they like to be experienced as an ideas person? How would they like to be experienced as somebody that you can have a conversation with? How would they like to be experienced as someone you absolutely want to bring along to every client? And once they start playing with that concept of brand, actually every other capability in the kit bag suddenly becomes really, really interesting, because they realize it is what will close the gap between where they are today and where they wish to be. I can't underplay or whatever the value of the 360 in helping people get a clear read on where the gaps are in relation to where they'd like to be and where the stakeholders see them.